For over 3,000 years, a divine truth has been hidden, shrouded in silence, erased from Scripture, and buried beneath centuries of dogma. What if the Bible never meant for you to know this? What if there was more to God than we've been taught? A forgotten twin, a divine presence that was once by his side, now erased from most of our understanding. In this exploration, we're pulling back the veil on a secret that's been there all along. Are you ready to see beyond the surface and uncover what's been deliberately concealed? You know that strange moment when you first read, "Let us make man in our image" in Genesis, and something just doesn't sit right? Yeah, you're not alone. That little plural twist, it's like a cosmic breadcrumb left behind. It hints at something bigger than just Yahweh, almost like a whispered code meant for those willing to look deeper. It's not just poetic flair, it's theological dynamite hiding in plain sight. People have been reading that same verse for centuries and shrugging it off as the royal we. But come on, do kings really talk like that when crafting the pinnacle of creation? This isn't a king ordering a feast. This is the Genesis plural voice, echoing from eternity, revealing a mystery most pastors won't even touch with a 10-foot pole. It's not heresy, it's history, buried, ignored, and waiting. When you hear us and our in Genesis, it's not a typo. It's a flare shot up into the spiritual sky. It points to a biblical mystery that's been poked and prodded by scholars, mystics, and theologians alike. Some say it was the divine council speaking, others whisper about a twin of God, long forgotten. Either way, it's way more than grammar. It's an open door to a past we were taught to forget. Real talk. If you're someone who's dug into the Dead Sea Scrolls or the ancient Hebrew texts, you've probably seen the pattern. Repeated hints, overlapping voices, unusual terms like Elohim, a word that straight up means gods in plural form. Now that doesn't mean polytheism. It means we've missed the richness in the original tongue, filtered out by translators, playing theological gatekeepers. And it gets wild, friend. Jewish mysticism, especially in the Kabbalistic tradition, talks about the veil of eternity, a sort of curtain where dimensions bend and divine realities hide. Behind that veil, that's where the forgotten truths hang out. The twin, the echo, the presence that walked alongside Yahweh in the garden's cool of the day. This isn't New Age fluff. It's deep, gritty, and raw. You ever wonder why modern Christianity avoids this stuff like it's radioactive? It's not because it's untrue. It's because it's uncomfortable, and it cracks the foundations of simplified theology. But look, the early rabbis, the ones who weren't afraid to ask the hard questions, they knew. They saw the fingerprints of more than one. That two powers in heaven concept? Yeah, it didn't just appear, it had roots. So how do we make this real? Start by reading Genesis in Hebrew. I know that sounds like a big ask, but even a free interlinear Bible online will do. Watch how often that plural sneaks in. Trace where Elohim shows up and ask yourself, is this the singular God we've been told about? Or is there a council at play, a team, a twin? And here's the kicker. If there was a second figure, a counterpart, a partner in the divine act of creation, where is he now? And why don't we talk about him anymore? That trail leads us to something even deeper, the mystery of the divine council. Here's where things really start to bend the mind a little. The word Elohim, it doesn't mean just God. It's a plural noun, friend. And in many places it behaves like one. So the big question becomes, who exactly is sitting around this divine boardroom with Yahweh? This is where the divine council comes in, like the spiritual UN of the ancient world. Think of it like this. Yahweh isn't alone up there, calling all the shots solo. Imagine a heavenly council chamber, filled with radiant beings, all with distinct roles. It's right there in Psalm 82. God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. Wait, gods? Plural? That's not poetic fluff, that's courtroom imagery. That's power dynamics in the heavens. In ancient Israelite belief, this council wasn't some rogue theory. It was standard. The prophets knew it. The scribes hinted at it. The ancient Hebrew texts describe a world where divine beings convene, deliberate, and carry out cosmic missions. Yahweh sits as the supreme authority, no doubt, but he's not without company. And among that company, whispers of a forgotten God begin to emerge. Now hold up, this doesn't mean we're talking about a pantheon like in Greek myths. Nope. This is more like a divine ecosystem. Different ranks, different tasks. Think of angels, seraphim, archangels. These weren't just pretty symbols. They were roles. Just like you've got a manager, a CEO, and a board of directors, the heavens seem to operate on similar lines. A wild twist. Some ancient rabbis believed one of the council members was so exalted, so close to Yahweh, that he even bore the name of God himself. This one wasn't just a divine employee, he was a co-ruler, a kind of twin of God. The seeds of this idea would later grow into the explosive two powers in heaven doctrine. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, barely. Here's something to chew on. The book of Job kicks off with a council meeting in heaven. The sons of God present themselves before Yahweh. Sounds like a committee roll call, doesn't it? And it's not an isolated case. You'll find these meetings scattered across the Old Testament, like spiritual staff meetings where eternal decisions get made. Let's get practical for a sec. If you're curious, and I hope you are, try reading Psalm 82 and Daniel 7 through. This lens, don't just scan, meditate. Ask yourself who the Ancient of Days is and who rides the clouds like a divine warrior. These aren't just metaphors. These are roles, clues, breadcrumbs pointing toward a deeper, older theology. Because if there is a divine council, and if one of its members was nearly indistinguishable from Yahweh, then we've got a real mystery on our hands. One that leads us to a moment in Genesis, let us make man in our image, that suddenly feels like a staff decision, not a monologue. And what does that mean for us, really? So picture this, you're made in the image of gods, plural. That's not some poetic twist, it's the raw language of Genesis. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. That us wasn't rhetorical, it was relational. Humanity wasn't shaped by a lone sculptor, but by a divine council, guided by a deeper blueprint hidden beneath layers of tradition. Now, here's the kicker. If multiple divine beings were involved in our creation, what does that say about you? It means you carry something far more complex than most churches will dare to preach. A spark of the Genesis plural voice, a multifaceted imprint. You're not just a reflection of Yahweh. You might be carrying a shadow of the twin of God himself. Ever felt like you had competing forces inside you, one tugging toward divine purpose, another whispering ancient longing? That's not just psychology, it could be spiritual DNA. The two powers in heaven, divided at creation, may still echo within humanity's design. Dual natures, dual pulls, a sacred tension woven into flesh and soul. Think about the implications. We're not just spiritual beings having a human experience. We're walking symbols of an ancient unity. The veil of eternity might have hidden the divine twin from the heavens, but echoes of him still stir in us. That moment you feel torn, between ego and empathy, it might just be the forgotten God calling from within. And if you want a tangible example, try journaling the moments where your instincts seem to contradict each other, where your heart says mercy, but your pride says justice. That's where you catch a glimpse of the dual imprint. And if you meditate on scriptures like John 1 or Colossians 1 through this lens, things will pop out that you've never noticed before. This dual divine image flips the narrative, doesn't it? We're not just little Yahwehs. We're bearers of something bigger, older, deeper. The echoes of El Elyon, the Most High, and his divine counsel still flow through our bloodline. That spiritual heritage was never meant to be erased. It was just buried, deliberately, quietly, and here's where it gets spicy. If there was a twin involved in creation, present in the ancient Hebrew texts, echoed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then erased from mainstream theology, wouldn't that change everything? From how we see ourselves to how we see salvation. Think about it. What if the story of redemption is also the story of reunion? Because if humanity bears the image of two, then salvation may not just be about reconciliation with one divine being, but a return to divine wholeness. And that's the moment we step into the next chapter, into the long-lost doctrine the early rabbis didn't just debate, they feared. So here's where things get real cloak and dagger. Ancient rabbis used to debate a concept that made their voices drop and eyes dart. The two powers in heaven. Sounds dramatic, right? That's because it was. This wasn't just theology. It was a threat. A doctrine so controversial, it eventually got stamped out like a fire in dry grass. Why? Because it implied something few wanted to entertain. That Yahweh had a counterpart. Not a rival, not a created angel, but a second power, equal in authority, clothed in divinity. This wasn't some outsider theory. It had roots in early Jewish mysticism and echoes all over the Dead Sea Scrolls. The rabbis didn't invent it, they inherited it. This second power wasn't just theory. He shows up again and again in fiery thrones, cloud chariots, and divine visions. Daniel 7, for example, presents two figures, the Ancient of Days and one like a son of man, separate yet one. Theologians later tried to collapse the two into one for simplicity's sake, but the texts, they resist that flattening. And what's wild is that early Jewish scholars were fine with this doctrine until it started looking a little too Christian. When early believers pointed to Jesus as this second power, suddenly the doctrine was declared heretical. See the irony? The belief wasn't banned because it was new. It was banned because it was ancient and dangerously close to the truth. Let me break it down with a real-life comparison. Imagine someone today finding an old family photo with a sibling nobody talks about. You ask your parents, and suddenly they get all quiet. Change the subject. That's what happened with the twin of God. His presence was too undeniable, too uncomfortable, so they erased him from the family album. And yet, he never really disappeared. The ancient Hebrew texts still whisper about him. The Jewish mysticism of the Second Temple period buzzes with his presence. He's there in the fiery chariot with Ezekiel. He's there wrestling Jacob until daybreak. He walks in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's not gone. He's just hidden. If you want to feel the tension, look at how carefully the Gnostic Christianity circles tiptoe around this figure. They knew something mainstream religion wasn't ready to say out loud. They saw the cracks in the surface, the fingerprints on the veil. And when the rabbis began to silence the doctrine, they weren't rejecting a heresy, they were covering a memory. And that memory leads us right into the heart of it, the erasure. The systematic removal of the divine twin from liturgy, theology, and collective consciousness, not by accident, not by oversight, but by deliberate design. And when something's erased that hard, it usually means it held power people weren't ready to face. Let's call it what it was, a cover-up. Not the kind you see in spy movies, but one carried out with pens, councils, and doctrine edits. The twin of God, present in the beginning, present in the fire, present in the voice that walked in Eden, began to vanish, slowly, strategically. A divine presence once accepted became theological contraband. The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in through translations, through political pressure, through the reshaping of monotheism into something cleaner, simpler. But simplicity comes with a cost. The Genesis plural voice, "Let us make man," was brushed off as poetic. The divine council became metaphor, the twin became myth. Why erase him? Because power prefers singularity. One name, one throne, one version of divinity to control the narrative. A twin of God muddied those waters. It suggested a divine relationship, that challenged hierarchies and centralized control. You can't package mystery into a doctrine without losing the wonder that birthed it. Imagine if we taught kids that God had a brother, not a created being, but a second light born of the same fire. Sounds wild, right? But early mystics didn't flinch. It was later theology that tightened the screws. Books were burned, names were banned, and texts that hinted at two powers in heaven were rewritten or ignored altogether. You want a real-world parallel? Think of the way indigenous histories have been rewritten or erased, stories lost, truths dismissed, spiritual identities replaced with sanitized versions. That's what happened here. The forgotten God became folklore, stripped from the pulpits and buried under centuries of polished orthodoxy. But you can still find the breadcrumbs. They're in the ancient Hebrew texts, in the plural names, in the divine conversations, in the mysterious figures who bear the authority of Yahweh yet remain distinct. They didn't just hide the twin, they buried him in plain sight. Hoping most wouldn't dig deep enough to ask real questions. And when people did start asking, like the early followers of Jesus or the mystics of Gnostic Christianity, they were quickly silenced, labeled heretics, cast out, because to reintroduce the twin wasn't just a theological debate, it was a disruption of everything. A divine sibling changes the family tree and the inheritance, but even buried truths tend to grow roots. And in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the divine council whispers and Jewish mysticism breathes again. The twin still stirs. He's not just erased, he's waiting. And where he reappears, he's often clothed in mystery, or in a name few dare speak. Metatron, even the name sounds like something out of a sci-fi epic, right? But this isn't fiction. It's rooted in ancient Jewish mysticism, tucked into the folds of forbidden texts and whispered through the corridors of the divine council. He's called the Lesser Yahweh, not because he's weaker, but because he mirrors the greater. Now don't get this twisted. Metatron isn't some random angel. He's something entirely other. Ancient rabbis wrote that he sits in the presence of the Holy One, which was unthinkable for anyone but God. He's the only being said to share Yahweh's name, authority, and even his throne. It's not subtle. It's divine duplication. In the ancient Hebrew texts, he's described as one who speaks with God's voice, acts with God's hand, and even carries his name. And while mainstream theology tries to sweep him into the archangel, Ubin, the mystics weren't fooled. They knew what they were looking at. This was the twin of God in veiled form. Metatron was the answer to the pieces that didn't fit. The voice in the burning bush that spoke as God, but not God. The mysterious man who wrestled Jacob until dawn, blessing him and renaming him Israel. These weren't just messengers. They were embodiments, representations of the two powers in heaven, walking the earth in shadow. If you want to feel this concept in action, reread Exodus 23. My name is in him. That's Yahweh talking about another being. Think about that. His name is in him. That's not delegation, that's possession. That's divine essence embedded in another. That's twinning, and that's Metatron. But here's where things get dicey. Metatron's identity was so close to Yahweh's that later scholars scrambled to redefine him. Some said he was Enoch transformed. Others tried to demote him to chief angel. But none of that explains the authority he held, or why early mystics bowed when they spoke of him. Because Metatron wasn't just a bridge, he was a remnant, a divine echo of the pre-creation unity. He may have taken on form, voice, and duty, but what lay beneath all that was something far older. A spark of the forgotten God, hidden in plain sight, carrying on the mission silently behind the veil of eternity. And this twin, cloaked in mystery and misdirection, didn't appear by accident. He was there because once, long before Babel, long before Eden, the divine was not singular. It was whole, It was one and two. And to understand that unity, we have to go even further back to a time before time. Before Genesis ever whispered, "Let there be light," there was something even more profound: unity. Not the cold, abstract kind, but a living, breathing oneness, a divine harmony. Picture the twin of God and Yahweh as a singular flame, distinct yet indistinguishable. No thrones, no hierarchy, just perfect balance beyond human reason. The biblical mystery begins here, not with creation, but with separation. Because the moment creation needed time and space, unity had to become duality. The twin stepped out, not away, but forward, so that the one could become known. The infinite veiled itself in the finite, and from that divine divide, the world was born. Think about it like this. When an artist paints, part of them moves into the canvas. Not all of them, just enough to create. That's what the twin did. He became the expression, the word, the visible hand of the invisible. He didn't start existing. He started appearing, like light breaking from a flame. In Jewish mysticism, this isn't heresy, it's depth. The veil of eternity is where the two were one. And behind that veil, all things were still, complete and in divine dialogue. No struggle, no ego, just an eternal rhythm where the Genesis plural voice wasn't confusing. It was natural. "Let us" was the echo of that original dance. You ever stare at the ocean and realize the waves and the sea are one thing, just seen differently? That's what this is. Yahweh and the twin of God, one essence, two movements. One holds the throne beyond time. The other enters the timeline to guide, intervene, and reveal. It's not dualism, it's divine synergy, and that synergy shaped everything: the stars, the laws of physics, the DNA we carry. We're made in the image of them, not him. That's not rebellion, that's scripture. The Elohim, the plural voice, made us reflect their plurality. Which means something wild. We're not just reflecting God, we're reflecting relationship. So when theologians erased the second, they didn't just erase a doctrine, they rewrote our origin story. That original unity holds the secret to divine identity, to our identity. But when unity becomes dangerous, it gets scattered, like light through a prism, and that scattering, it shows up dramatically at Babel. What was once a perfect oneness gets pulled apart. Language fractures, nations divide, the voice becomes many, and the twin of God, once visible, starts slipping, out of frame, not gone, just hidden, waiting for the right time, the right eyes, and the right questions. The Tower of Babel wasn't just about bricks and pride, it was a divine rupture. Humanity tried to reach the heavens, yes, but what was really lost that day was clarity. The shared tongue wasn't just language, it was understanding, connection. The Genesis plural voice got scrambled, and with it, the visibility of the twin of God. Here's the kicker. Babel wasn't just punishment, it was fragmentation. The divine plurality that once walked with Adam, guided Noah, and whispered to Abraham was suddenly scattered like shards of a mirror. The divine council no longer spoke in unison. Their voices split across nations, buried in myth, mystery, and time. In ancient Hebrew texts, Babel is more than a tale. It's a fault line. The forgotten God, once so near, fades into a collective amnesia. Different cultures retain fragments, echoes of divine twins, warrior brothers, shining messengers. But in the Hebrew tradition, silence, not denial, just omission. Theologians turned Babel into a story of arrogance. But mystics? They saw it as the burial ground of divine memory. The twin of God wasn't destroyed. He was hidden, dismantled, across cultures, disguised in legends, folded into language itself. Ever notice how stories of twin deities pop up everywhere? That's no accident. Take a look at Mesopotamian lore. Egyptian dualities, even Greco-Roman myths, twin gods, sun and shadow, order and chaos. Babel wasn't the end of the twin. It was the beginning of his anonymity. The veil of eternity thickened, and in that mist, the two powers in heaven became just one, publicly. That shift had consequences. Without the visible twin, the image of God became monolithic, rigid. Spiritual nuance collapsed, and people started asking, why is God silent? Why does he seem so far? Because half of the voice was buried. The burial at Babel wasn't just about confusion. It was about disconnection. Still, the signs remained, in names, in rituals, in symbols carved into ancient stones. You'd have to be looking closely, of course. But if you knew what to search for, like the presence of El Elyon and the multiple gods of early Israelite texts, you'd see it. The divine wasn't lost, it was layered. And those layers, they whisper if you listen. You won't hear them in every sermon. You won't find them in every pew, but in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the fringes of Gnostic Christianity, in the mystical folds of the Zohar, the twin still breathes. Which begs the question, where else was he edited out? Ever wonder why some Bible verses feel incomplete, like a sentence that trails off just before revealing something big? That's not your imagination. It's what scholars call scriptural silences, gaps, redactions, and subtle tweaks where traces of the twin of God once stood. What's not said is often what matters most. The ancient scribes were meticulous, but not always transparent. In the wake of rising monotheism, the two powers in heaven became a theological liability, so the texts got cleaned up. Passages that once hinted at divine plurality were flattened. Words like Elohim were domesticated, made to sound singular. Take Genesis 1:26. Let us make man in our image. That us used to be a clue, but most modern interpretations rush to explain it away. It's a royal we, they say, or God speaking to angels. Really, angels don't create. Only the divine council held that authority. And the Genesis plural voice is no accident. Same with Deuteronomy 32:8-9. In early versions, El Elyon divides the nations according to the number of the sons of God. But later versions, they quietly switch sons of God to sons of Israel. Subtle shift, big implication. That one edit buries the divine counsel and erases the forgotten God from plain view. Want another example? Isaiah's holy, holy, holy moment. The throne room is full. Voices, beings, coals, power. But who is the one speaking with God's authority? Why does God say, "Who will go for us?" The twin stands in the shadows again, just out of reach. Close enough to feel, too hidden to name. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, oh, they're gold. They show earlier versions of the Bible that reveal divine plurality more openly. Names like Metatron and references to multiple heavenly thrones weren't fringe. They were foundational. But those voices were later silenced to enforce religious uniformity. It's like spiritual revisionism, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear that people wouldn't understand, that acknowledging divine multiplicity would shatter faith rather than deepen it. So the twin wasn't denied, he was made invisible, buried not in myth but in translation, hidden behind theological edits. But here's the twist. The silence only makes the whisper louder. In the corners of Scripture, in the margins of canon, the twin of God lingers, waiting for a reader bold enough to ask, what else was edited out? What else lies behind the veil of eternity? Because once you start seeing the gaps, you can't unsee them. They thought he was gone, lost in legend, buried beneath dogma, erased by scribes. But you can't bury the divine. Not really. The twin of God was never destroyed, only hidden. And like a buried seed, there are signs he's beginning to rise again. Quietly, subtly, but undeniably. The Dead Sea Scrolls whisper of a heavenly figure seated beside Yahweh, not a servant, a sovereign. Called by many names, Metatron, the lesser Yahweh, the name that is like his name. Sound familiar? That's not just coincidence. That's legacy, fragments of the twins surfacing in plain sight. In Jewish mysticism, this return is layered in symbols. The second voice reappears in dreams, visions, and secret teachings. Not as a rival, but as the long missing half. Together, they represent divine completeness. Not division, not heresy, wholeness. A celestial echo reuniting with its source. Look at the Book of Enoch, the Zohar, even the murmurings of Gnostic Christianity. There's always a second figure, a guide, a revealer, a veiled light behind the throne. When John says, "In the beginning was the Word," he's not inventing something new, he's reawakening what had been buried for centuries. And the world today, it's hungry for mystery, for truth that breaks through the noise. That's why this return matters. Because once you recognize the two powers in heaven, you start to see patterns in your own life. Times when guidance came from a place that felt familiar, like it already knew you. This isn't abstract theology, it's spiritual reality. People dream of light they can't explain, feel watched in moments of despair, sense a presence standing beside them when they pray. These aren't coincidences. They may be traces, reflections of the forgotten God, drawing near again. So what do you do with that? You start paying attention, reread old scriptures with fresh eyes, explore the Apocrypha, the ancient commentaries, the mystical traditions. You don't need a seminary degree, just curiosity and courage, because the veil of eternity isn't sealed forever. It's thinner than you think, and now that the whispers are returning, the real question is, will you recognize him when he shows up? Not on a throne, but in a question, a dream, a flicker of divine déjà vu. Because the twin didn't disappear. He's just been waiting for someone like you to remember. As we journey through the pages of Scripture, it becomes evident that what has been hidden wasn't a mistake. The divine presence, once plural, was deliberately obscured, likely for our own spiritual growth. The search for the twin of God isn't about challenging the foundation of faith, but rather enriching it. True understanding of the Creator goes beyond the narrow limits we've placed on Him. It's a call to embrace the mystery and the depth of God's nature beyond our conventional perceptions. The Bible itself is a dynamic story of revelation. It is not static. It reveals, conceals, and unfolds over time. If we approach it with open hearts, we begin to see the nuances of the divine, from Yahweh to the hidden voices that may still resonate today. The veil of eternity is not there to keep us from the truth, but to invite us into a deeper relationship with it, where divine mysteries unfold on God's timing, not ours. In understanding the two powers in heaven, we recognize that God's work is not solitary. It was never meant to be. The divine unity, while foundational, also contains a beautiful, harmonious plurality that brings greater depth to the story of creation. And when we understand this, we can apply it in our lives, seeing ourselves as part of a divine plan much larger than we might have imagined. So, as you reflect on these teachings, remember that knowledge is not just for the mind, it's for the heart. To truly know God, to see beyond the surface, is to embrace the divine complexity. Start asking questions. Look deeper into the scriptures, explore the layers of Jewish mysticism, Gnostic Christianity, and the Dead Sea Scrolls to better understand the fullness of the divine. If you found this exploration eye-opening, I invite you to subscribe to Light of Grace, where we delve into the richness of God's Word and the mysteries that have been hidden for centuries. Join our journey to uncover more truths that can transform your life and faith. Turn on notifications so you never miss out on the next divine revelation.